My name is Yechiel Bar-Chaim. I'm an economist, not an educator, and an economist with an interest in social policy, not so much with the individual destiny of individual children. And that will influence the tone and the content of my presentation. I work, after a long career in the field as a community organizer and being involved in humanitarian aid in Central Europe and North Africa, I work now as an independent consultant on philanthropy for socially excluded peoples, including people with disabilities, mainly as concerns the Czech Republic and Israel. And in this presentation, I'm inspired by two very fine gentlemen. Some of you will know whom I'm talking about. The first is the founder of what once was Czechoslovakia, Thomas Garrigue Masaryk. And I recall him because he was, first of all, in my opinion, a champion of the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. He also fought for the self-determination of oppressed peoples, not just Czechs and Slovaks, but Croats and Serbs and Jews. And in his autobiographical conversations with Karel Čapek, he made, I think, a very important point which is worth remembering. And that is that the acceptance of the other, or the tolerance of the other, is a learned virtue. It is not natural. And I think many of you as teachers recognize this. And it's not just in school that one learns this virtue. One has to learn it from experience and from involvement with others. And the second person is a 92-year-old, almost 92-year-old gentleman in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dr. Alfred Bader, who was excluded from schools when the Nazis took over Vienna and Austria in 1938, and left for England on a kinder transport, only to be imprisoned by His Majesty's government when he turned 16 as an enemy alien, because he came from part of the Third Reich. And after a year and a half in a camp in Canada, he was excluded from the best Canadian universities who did not want European Jews to populate their classes. None of this deterred him. He went on to get a doctorate in chemistry from Harvard and to build what became over time what was the most profitable research chemical company in the world. And he has been sort of my sponsor for this kind of work for the past 20 years. But the reason I recall him in particular has to do with one evening here in Prague, perhaps 12 years ago, when I organized at the Prague Jewish community an evening about Roma in Kosovo at the time. And besides Alfred and Isabel Bader and myself and the speaker, only about 3 people showed up. And at a certain moment, Alfred, who was then around 80, jumped out of his chair and started screaming. And he said, "What's the matter with you? Don't you realize these people are suffering?" And the small group that was there we didn't know what was going on, but clearly he was crying to all the people who hadn't come and who were indifferent and who thought that Roma were of no account. Now, if there's one man who has done so much for the Roma population of Europe in the past 20, 25 years, it is George Soros. And I would like to begin the content of my presentation with a quotation from him. So, how does this work? Yes. Let me read part of that. My father taught me that it's much better to face harsh reality than to close your eyes to it. Once you are aware of the dangers, your chances of survival are much better if you take some risks than if you meekly follow the crowd. That is why I trained myself to look at the dark side. And now I would like to invite you to follow me for a short walk on the dark side. Because after all the wonderful things we've heard from the other speakers about the progress that's being made and the bright future we can hope for, I permit myself to present to you maybe the dark side and what in French we call the bémol, the sort of the minor key. So please bear with me, and I hope you will trust in my goodwill in presenting this to you. Now, if we look at social inequality, I like to divide the causes or the categorization into three groups. The first is direct discrimination. Now, we all know what direct discrimination is, and when I was a boy in many states in the United States, whites went to this school and blacks went to another school. And that was the law in many of these states until Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. And direct discrimination has largely vanished from the world as we know it. However, there's a second category of discrimination, and it's one that should interest you very much because this is the one that the Czech Republic was found guilty of by the European Court of Human Rights. It's called indirect discrimination. Now, what is indirect discrimination? We also have this in the United States today. In the United States today, educational funding depends on very local school districts. If you live in a wealthy district, you have a big shopping mall which pays lots of property taxes, you have well-financed schools. You live in a poor district, and your schools are poorly financed. Now, that's indirect discrimination in the sense that, to the extent that a better school gives you a better financed school gives you a better education, if you're poor, you're being, or you live in a poor district, you're being discriminated against. And I know because I'm a product of that system. My father moved into a school district that we could not afford, so I could go to a better school. And you'll have to judge the results. The third concept, and I think by far the most interesting, is disparate impact. And we've heard some of the speakers today, in a sense, talk about disparate impact. In other words, you have a standard law or a school program, and the results are different for different pupils. And for a long time, people sort of thought, well, that's the way it is, right? I mean, I'm doing the best I can. But then, when you start to say, why? Why are some people succeeding and other people not? Why, for example, in most countries, is there a huge gap between the success of boys on matriculation exams and girls? We saw this in the charts from Finland. I'm looking at charts in Israel of Ethiopian Israelis. The girls are 20 points higher than the boys, and people aren't asking why, and that's disparate impact. And the day will come when somebody will take this to a court of human rights, and that will be declared indirect discrimination. Now, let's talk a little bit about indirect discrimination in the Czech Republic. You were found, your government, your nation was found guilty because the percentage of Roma children in special schools was 3 or 4 times higher than the percentage of Roma children in the population. So, and actually we heard yesterday at the visit to Lichova Nyamiesti school that 20 years ago it was almost automatic, at least in some areas. Oh, you're Roma? That's your school, okay? Down the block. Please go there. But, regardless of whether you think it was done arbitrarily or whether it was done by an objective standard of some sort, the problem, in my opinion, and one of the points I want to make today, is that the issue is not limited to the special schools. The bigger issue is what happens to Roma children in the mainstream schools. And there you have an even much bigger problem, and as I will argue later on, the new reform and the fine intentions really do not begin to address that issue. Because in the Czech Republic you don't really measure or publicize educational results for Roma children very much, or it's not public knowledge, I went in January to Slovakia and visited 2 schools for Roma in the Roma Osade, the settlements near Kosice. And I'm calling this ground zero of the issue. I'm not making any claims that the results you're going to see are true for any other place. But I want you to see, just like we saw the picture of how the Finnish Roma lived in the 1950s, I want you to see where a sizable part of Roma population is today in Slovakia. And you will think about it in your own terms. In Slovakia, they do nationwide tests. And for all the criticisms that can be leveled at it, that the teachers are focused only on success in the tests, for example, these are the results. Now, you have to look, I'm not sure how this works exactly. I have to look at this 4th line. You have math and you have Slovak language. Now, 0 means 0. So after 5 years, the average score in math, 5 years of schooling, the average score in math for these children from the Osada is 2.6. And the national average is 18.6. And in Slovak language, the average score is 4.10, and the national average is about 20. Now, I don't know how you think about those results, but what I think is they're a waste of everybody's time and money. The children aren't learning, the teachers are not having any satisfaction from their teaching, and the state may have the appearance of having universal education, but that's not education, in my humble opinion. Without saying who's responsible, or not saying yet what has to be done. There's worse to come. In the second Osada, in the second Osada, the principal pulled out for me the individual test scores. Now, this was a school with 70% Roma and the rest white majority Slovaks. And I asked that the names be removed. I don't know if you can see this, or how many of you can see this. But if you want to know who the Roma... How do I get the light on? Okay, good. This one. Sorry. Whoops. Okay. Now, if you want to identify the Roma students, you look in the Slovak language scores, and you see these very low scores. You want to see the native Slovaks in the same line, you see the higher scores in the Slovak language. Not particularly high, but still much higher. And all I'm asking you to do is to take a Roma student in Slovak language and go across and see the result in math. And so on and so forth. And you can go down the list and see that even in a partially mixed school, the Roma pupils are still learning nothing and wasting their time and everyone else's time. And the one thing that is deceiving, and this is deceiving in the Czech Republic, they are accumulating years in school. So you can look at the percentage of Roma children finishing or nearly finishing primary school and think that, well, maybe that's not so bad. But start looking at the content of those years, and you're facing a different story altogether. And that is what I learned on that trip in January. Now, if that is a reality in some place, and let's say we're in Slovakia at the moment, but we might as well be here, the question is, what goal should take priority? Now, I'm not proposing, and I haven't heard any voices here proposing autonomy or emancipation for Roma or any other minority. And it's a very political, governmental issue which I tend not to get involved in. When I was a young man in the civil rights schedule, we only talked about equality of opportunity. And it was a dangerous idea to think that what you really wanted was equality of results. And, well, some years have gone by. And I'm saying when you see inequality of results, you have to ask why, and you have to doubt whether there really is or was such a thing as equality of opportunity. So I don't accept equality of opportunity as the proper goal. The goal that I prefer is empowerment, achievement. And unless the disabled and the Roma and the other minority and everyone else whom you want to include in the schools achieves a level of achievement that enables them to live a decent life as citizens, then you haven't done anything. Forgive me my harshness. Integration and inclusion, frankly, I've never really been able to understand what that is. You know, whether you have a group inside the larger group or they're all spread out. They play together after school, they don't play together after school. I think if Thomas Masaryk were here and ready to brave violence in his classroom as he did when he defended the Jew Hilsner in that famous ritual murder trial, I think if he were here, he would say that in the Czech Republic and in terms of the reform, when it comes to Roma, integration and inclusion are something between an illusion and a fantasy. You have Roma living in segregated neighborhoods. No one's talking about busing them. They're poor, they can't pay for public transport. They're not going to go to the other side of town on their own. You are not going to have integrated schools here where Roma are concerned. You're just not. The numbers aren't there, the conditions aren't there. I think there's a session in one of the workshops about that. And your ministry is busy reassuring the public that, well, we're not going to really change very much, and certainly not break up the all-Roma schools and create integrated schools. So let's face that. Let's face that and digest it and let it sink in. Empowerment, which I've adopted as a rule, means taking responsibility for your own destiny. or as Tamara Kovacevic taught me, having the community. Wait a minute, I skipped a line. She taught me that empowerment means nothing about us without us. In other words, we're the ones, we, the Roma, we, the pupils, we, the parents, we, the teachers, we're the ones who need to create this reality. This is a picture of Dr. Mahmoud Zodi in the Israeli Arab town of Al-Fahim. 15 years ago, when the Islamic movement won elections there, the dropout rate was 38%. They came together as a community, the social workers, the preschool institutions, the health clinics, the city government, the teachers, the parents. Now the dropout rate is 0.5%. And they've done away with child marriage in that town, which used to be very prevalent. So I think the first thing we should be looking for is community organization and community involvement, starting in the Roma community itself. And I'm very glad to see Edita and Mr. Ruzicka here and others who are working precisely towards that goal. And the other aspect is to realize, and maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't, that the traditional methods for augmenting education are fine for those who are already succeeding. They're not the system that's going to advance those who cannot cope well with the existing system. And I've been exposed to a number of systems. One is Feuerstein Instrumental Enrichment, another Sister Cyril Mooney's Value-Based Education, and a third called REST, which is bringing the experience, the successful experience in England with Roma pupils who have come out of special schools here to learn there, to bring that experience here. And for those of you who are interested, if you go on YouTube and Google my name, you can see a whole lecture about Feuerstein in the school that I'm about to mention. And the point being that we have to look at student motivation, not just what teachers are able to give, but what students want to achieve when they're there. And monitoring. This question of monitoring individual progress, I think, is an excellent tool. My understanding is not used very much here. This is Mrs. Rabab Nasser, the principal of the Ort Comprehensive Arab High School in the town of Ramle, serving pupils from the very poorest neighborhood. And she's been principal for 6 years. For 4, she tried everything that will sound familiar to you. Easing the less successful teachers out, reducing class size, breaking the classes up into small groups, making the learning relevant, adding after-school hours. And it didn't matter a bit. It didn't matter a bit. She said, I couldn't see that it was making much of a difference. And then she was given a prize for failing, like a general who loses the war. And she invested that in bringing the Feuerstein system into her school. The system which is now being used in the Svitavi school with great success, and there should be a YouTube video on that as well. And I want to show you, after 1 year, what happened. They took the 9th grade, divided it up by learning ability, and after 1 year, these are the results in math and language. And the idea is we focus on learning ability. We don't focus on math and Hebrew or Arabic. We focus on learning ability. We all think, but how aware are we of how we think, or of how it would be a good idea that we thought? Some of us are impulsive. Some of us don't have notions of time. And this is a system that focuses on inculcating a manner of thinking, a system of thinking. There. We've taken a trip on the dark side. In the end, I've tried to give you some ideas about what might be done to change the levels of achievement. I feel I've taken a heavy responsibility in going against the title of this conference. I'm deeply grateful to Bob Kartosh for inviting me here. And I realize that you are the people who are going to have to make this reform work. And you are the people who will have to lead the campaign to raise the level of achievement, not just of physically disabled youngsters, which I think the system is capable of doing, but also to address the huge issue that is the result of the segregation of the Roma, of their incredibly distress in the neighborhoods, and the problems, the broader social problems affecting what might be called inclusion or integration of Czech society. Now, any campaign, if you're the soldiers, you have to be inspired to lead the battle. And what better place to go to than the Battle of Agincourt 600 years ago, when King Henry and his small band of brothers defeated a French army 3 to 6 times larger. And from this famous speech of St. Crispin's Day, I've extracted 2 sentences. So this is Henry V, Act 4, Scene 3, just before the battle. You should see the film by Ken Branagh, and again, if you go on YouTube, you can see this speech in its entirety. The fewer men, the greater share of honor. Now, why is that important here? Of all the countries in Central and European Europe, of all the countries with a substantial Roma population, you, the Czechs, have been singled out and threatened with punishment unless you change the way you educate Roma children. Now, instead of feeling sorry for yourself or defensive, why us? In Bulgaria, it's much worse. And I know that it's much worse. You should take pride because you will show the way, or you can show the way. Let's say you will show the way to the rest of Central and Eastern Europe how this is possible. Because the one thing that I didn't mention, and I have to mention, at least Feuerstein, but I think the others, it's not only motivation that's changed, it's actually the level of intelligence. Once you have a system for thinking, you're actually smarter. And I've taken a few lessons from this myself, so I do recommend it. And then the second line, which comes later in the speech, all things are ready if our minds be so. Think about that. He's leading an army. He has to have equipment, he has to have weapons, he has to have crossbows. But what counts is what's here. And so you and me and all of us will be ready once we're able to think clearly and know what we're about. But not everyone is charging off into battle, and Shakespeare also has a word from a more hesitant prince. Hamlet is famously indecisive and somewhat self-pitying. You know, why am I faced with this? And it reads in Act 1, Scene 5, the time is out of joint. O cursed spite that ever I was born to set it right. And usually when people quote that, they stop there. They stop there. Why me? Why me? Why in my single lifetime am I confronted with this? I would much rather be dealing with something else. But look at the last line. He says to his friends, "Nay, come, let us go together." So whatever despair or discouragement or frustration you might feel in launching this new campaign, give a thought that there's a group of us and we can express solidarity. Nay, come, let us go together. Décrit.